So the photograph is often the memory. In many different societies, mothers who are carrying the photographs of their disappeared children and demanding their return in Argentina, but also in Mexico and in Peru. I mean, that image of the mother holding the photograph as a demand of justice that's not been served. And the photograph becomes an actor in that sense.
Pares, toma 1.
Bienvenidos a Entre Pares. Este es un espacio de conversación en la Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú. Mi nombre es María Eugenia Ulfe, soy profesora principal del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales de esta casa de estudios y hoy tenemos el honor de contar con la presencia de Marianne Hirsch. Ella es profesora emérita de English and Comparative Literature and Gender Studies de la Universidad de Columbia. It's an honor to have you at PUC for the 8th Congress of the Memory Studies Association that we entitled Memories in Transit. And thank you for the opportunity to have the moment to talk to you about your work on memory studies.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
In your work, you connect feminist theory with memory studies, focusing on how memories of violence are passed down through generations, what makes post-memory relevant, and how do memories of experiences of traumatic events continue to impact on people who haven't directly experienced them.
Yes, so you might ask, why another post? We have postmodernism, we have post-traumatic stress disorder, we have a lot of posts right now, postmodernity, of course. Why another post? Well, it came to me both through personal experience and through a scholarly inquiry to try to understand why people who have not lived through very powerful experiences feel that they remember them. Now, of course, they don't remember them, they were not there, but somehow it feels effectively, emotionally, it feels like memory. So that was very much my personal experience and that of my generation of descendants of Holocaust survivors. And in many ways, I felt sometimes that I remembered my parents' experiences more powerfully than my own childhood memories because they had told me these stories. I visualized what happened on a certain street on a certain day, and those things really impacted me. Of course, they were not memories. They were transmitted to me indirectly and very partially. This was not a story I could really piece together, but they were germs of stories, they were shadows, they were traces. And when I spoke to other people in my generation and began to read works, artworks, novels, memoirs, graphic novels of people in my generation, I found similar kinds of experiences. Now, these also have been corroborated scientifically in neuroscience. For example, through epigenetics, right? That people, epigenetic research is not so much with humans, it's often with mice, but that subsequent generations are impacted epigenetically, that these things are inscribed in the epigenetic makeup, somehow that can shift the genetic makeup so that everyday experiences of poverty, of suffering, can be inherited by subsequent generations. It's very important to then remember that these were not actually remembered, that those of us in subsequent generations are not the victims. It was their story. It was our ancestors' stories. It's not our stories. We are not second-generation survivors or second-generation victims. We are descendants. But with this legacy, these very powerful legacies of not only violent, but very powerful experiences like coups or revolutions, right? Or earthquakes that are social and historical moments that affect a whole generation, that these come with certain responsibilities. And when you say, yes, I combine feminist theory, why feminist theory? Because there's a responsibility there to create a space where voices that may not be part of the historical archive can be heard, that ordinary, small experiences, that we create a space where those could be heard, and that we challenge an official narrative by inserting smaller, less, grandiose stories to fill out a multiplicity of stories to create a hybrid and a diverse and a multiple record of the past.
And in that way also we can talk that, it's the world of memory and the world of affections, of emotions, of subjectivity in a way. And when you speak, you talk from your own family experience and how, in your research also as a Holocaust scholar about memories, how can we, use the post-memory approximation to speak about other kinds of memories, like in Peru, for example. That, you are now here in Peru for the first time. You visit the Museum of Memory. And in Peru, we have, I belong to the first generation, but there are younger generations. And how can we talk about this idea of post-memory, using it to other contexts?
Yeah, so sometimes I've been a little bit afraid that by starting with the Holocaust, which was my own experience, that excludes other stories. But in fact, I think this idea of how memories, powerful memories of violence or life-changing events get transmitted across generations, that this idea of post-memory has spoken to people who have very, very different kinds of histories across the globe. And it's actually really interesting for me to have this conversation in Peru. It's a much more recent conflict that has not been over for very long, not even a quarter of a century yet. And that is extraordinarily complex and where the losses were enormous. The losses of lives and the losses of life worlds that were destroyed. And what happens to subsequent generations? How do they process these memories? Now, in some instances, there's silence in families. Okay, if we speak about families only, there's silence, right? People don't want to talk about trauma. What I found so moving at the museum is the testimonies, the stories that are being told. And there are testimonies from second generation, from people who were children of senderos and also children of the victims. And that was very, very interesting to me because you could trace in their words how they process both their parents' or grandparents' suffering, but also the perpetration, what it means to be a descendant of a perpetrator. And it's only through testimony and voice that you can really do that. Now, I don't think, I know that I started with this idea from a familial perspective, but as I've been developing this concept over the years now, decades, I've realized that it's not just within families that we can discuss post-memory. I see it as a generational structure, and even those whose families were not directly impacted inherit these memories as part of a cohort, as part of a generational cohort, because the family is part of a larger social structure, and memory is constructed not only through the stories that your parents tell you or don't tell you, and the silences that they have. It's constructed through public institutions, museums. It's constructed through pedagogies in school. It's constructed through literary works and artworks and films and the media and multiple media. And it's always also contested.
Yes.
So I think that the family is part of this fabric of a memory that's not static, but that it's constantly evolving. And then it's also constructed in relation to more current events. So memory change, the past changes. And I find that very encouraging because I feel like we can change a traumatic past. We can work with it to make it less traumatic. And I can talk more about that, but it's a more recent idea.
Yes, and I mean you mentioned sound, you mentioned artwork, and you use mouse.
Yes. Art
I mean,
Spiegelman's
Art
wonderful
Spiegelman,
graphic
exactly.
memoir that's a
Uh-huh.
classic now of
Yes,
memory.
and also you have a book in which you use family photo albums. And what is that is so powerful about the image and the photographs to convey memories?
I've been working a lot with images. I'm a scholar of literature, and of course, the words are very important. But I came to family photos by thinking about how do families preserve the past and how do they hand the past on. And photography in the last 150 years or more has become that medium since it was democratized with cameras that
Yeah.
everybody had. The other amazing thing about photographs is that they're disseminated. So even if a whole family or a whole town is destroyed, the photos had been sent to relatives somewhere else. So the existence cannot be contested. They were here, so those photos are a record of the past. But also, photos themselves are not static. They change in relation to when you look at it. So this is something that I've been working with, the idea that the photograph was taken at a certain moment when those people facing the camera did not yet know what their future was. When we look at the photograph now, we know what their future was. But should we be allowed to backshadow? The scholar Michael Andre Bernstein has this idea of backshadowing, not foreshadowing, but backshadowing. Should we determine them already as victims because we know they will be? Can we grant them their own present, their own future that they were anticipating? So I'm particularly interested in photos of children, and I've co-written this book on school photos, class pictures, to think about children who are looking forward to a life, who are anticipating a future, whose future was cut short. But do we need to see them only as victims, or can we see them in the moment that the photo was taken and the future of the past, the future that they were anticipating? And how does that change the past and make it richer? Because that their hopes, their dreams as they were facing the camera is also part of history. Right? We have to include it in the historical record as well. So photos are the things that often survive the survivors, right? They survive way beyond our own lifetime, and they will be looked at in future generations. So I'm interested in not only what do they mean, but what do they do? How are they themselves historical actors in the world? How are they used? How do they live on? And how are they also lost? Because you can go to flea markets and you can get people's albums and we don't know who they are, right?
Yes.
But what's our responsibility to care for them?
And also, I mean, in this moment when, we have this technology that we get images in a second, and there is also this manipulation of images or abuse or, uses of images. No? And there is also this fully dissemination about images, and that we sometimes have to be also very careful about, like how, as you say, be responsible of the use of these images. There is a thesis in the master program in visual anthropology about photograph of young university students who were disappeared in Peru. And one of the things my colleague mentions, Mercedes Figueroa, she speaks about how these university students are, in a way, their memories are preserved at home as if they were always the age when they left.
I was very struck in the museum by the school pictures and the university pictures and the role of schooling and university in the conflict in Peru, and because the conflict was often in the schools, right? And the pedagogy, what students are supposed to learn in school, was completely changed in this period, right? But we do see young people who become politically engaged, and then often whose future is really being robbed from them. So the photograph is often the memory. And we have, why do we have actually in many different societies, mothers who are carrying the photographs of their disappeared children and demanding their return in Argentina, but also in Mexico and in Peru. I mean, that image of the mother holding the photograph as a demand of
Justice.
justice that's not been served, and the photograph becomes an actor in that sense, right? And it's not just mothers, it's hijos also, right? It's again through generations, but you're right, that person remains at that age, and that's what's very moving, because their whole cohort
Exactly.
are old people now,
Yes.
but they will always be those young people. And there's that disjunction of time that I think in photography, between the time the image was taken and the time it's being looked at, that's very moving and
Moving,
poignant,
yes.
right? And that's where, the work of Roland Barthes comes in, who wrote this wonderful book on photography, where he talks about time as like you look at someone in a photograph and you know he's going to die. But he's not dead when he's in
not,
so
yeah.
so I feel like we need to look at, no, he was alive, he had a future, and it was cut short, and we need justice. So the photograph can be an object of demand for justice.
Yeah. I mean, you are a child survivor of the Holocaust and a scholar of Holocaust memory. I read your recent piece about rethinking memory politics of the Holocaust after October 7th last year. I mean, would you like to explain more about the dangers of building this Holocaust memory on victimization alone? Or, I mean, and it actually, we can use it in a more general panoramic view, because victimization alone can be problematic.
Well, that's a wonderful question, so thank you for that. So I'm not the child survivor, I'm a child of survivors, right? And I never thought I would be studying this history. Like many of us, when we're young, we want to get away from our parents' lives, and certainly from our parents' suffering. And my parents didn't even want to be suffering, to have been victims. But the story became important in the 1980s when we felt, my cohort, this generation, really felt that the history itself had not been told in a granular way by listening to the voices of survivors, and the fear that they would be dying out and we would not really know the history. So it was also a kind of call for justice, but it came together with a framework of thinking about trauma, which was extremely compelling. And trauma these were experiences, like in the horrific history of Peru and other places, that's almost unthinkable and unspeakable. What some people went through, not my own family because they were not in camps, but the stories that people told were very difficult to verbalize, because there was no framework in which to talk about them, because it was unthinkable. It was coming from another universe. And when their stories were videotaped or audio taped, you could see memory at work. You could see how memory is in the body and in language, and how language your mouth can dry up because you cannot utter those words. That, for a scholar of literature, is extremely fascinating, but also very, very moving to study, because history is alive in those bodies, right? So that became then somehow trauma studies and Holocaust studies came up around the same time in the early 80s. It was then that post-traumatic stress disorder from the war in Vietnam was diagnosed. So trauma became the framework. And at that point, the Holocaust came to be studied through the frame of trauma, and those who were traumatized, of course, were victims. And that I think became the dominant story, and it still is in many ways. We have films and novels and memoirs coming out about this history almost every month or week, really. We're not done, because it's still very hard to understand. But I think the danger of using victimization as the frame to tell a history is that it can be exclusionary. Extreme trauma and having the Holocaust be the symbol of genocide and any other kind of destruction of lives and life worlds is not as bad as that. So you make it the extreme of history. I think that's taking it out of history, really, and making an exclusionary history. And I think that's very dangerous politically, but it's also not helpful in working through the past. When are we done? Well, we're in the second generation, third, now it's the fourth. We're still victims. And I think what happens in the case of Jews around the world and Israel, where in fact there is anti-Semitism, we cannot deny that it's there, but this history cannot authorize the violence that's taking place in Gaza. And that's why I tried in this short piece to rethink this trauma framework and to learn. And I think that's one of the great things that's happened in memory studies, is that we're doing comparative work. So I think people in Holocaust studies can learn from scholars of slavery, from scholars of dictatorship, to see different ways of living with a difficult past that's being passed down through generations. So I think if we look at our approaches in relation to each other, I think we can maybe rethink this victimization and the idea of the traumatic return, that it's always on the verge of happening again.
Yes.
And we can think more about what it means, never again or nunca más.
Yeah. And also, I mean, in a way, you say something that is very important. I mean, when you draw this victimization alone, it's somehow creating it as an event that it's like uphold and I don't know, and far from history and not historicized. And,
Right.
And the big problem is basically when you create the sensation of dehistorization, because then it becomes of political use for someone or groups or.
Well, we can't deny that these awful experiences have been handed down, and that in fact there is transgenerational trauma. I'm sure you're seeing it in Peru, that descendants are also traumatized, that they remember that it's in their bodies, that those stories are in their bodies, that those are, that we can't deny that. But that can also easily be manipulated, politically and ideologically manipulated, because we can feed people's fears.
Exactly.
Right? We can amplify them. We can make them larger and larger. And then we come to a kind of defensiveness, the vulnerability that turns into defensiveness and that turns into aggression, because the safety and security becomes the main thing because you're so afraid. So that's the manipulation of memory from every side. It's
Exactly.
not only the right that manipulates memory, the left can manipulate memory as well.
Yeah, creating these enemies.
Creating the other.
The other,
that's
exactly.
always endangering you. Right?
Exactly. And threatening you all the time.
And how do you not do that and still do justice to the pain of the past, right?
Exactly.
That's very difficult.
Yeah, because violence creates this very incommensurable trauma and suffering. I mean, that we can feel it, as you say,
Yes.
So just to finish, how are we going to work through these very complex and deep memories, transmit and comprehend these memories of what we see now in the world?
You want me to answer that?
Well, at least say something.
Well, there are certain ways to look at it that I think would be helpful, and that's the kinds of conversations that we have at conferences, like the Memory Studies Association, did go across different cultures. So I feel like in Holocaust studies, I've learned a lot from memories of slavery and from my colleagues who study slavery, because there it's not only pure victimization. It's song, it's survival, it's will to survive, right? It's beauty, it's pleasure, it's in the most horrific circumstances. So that's been kind of the accent, whereas in Holocaust studies it was victimization. So when we talk about Peru, I would like to know sort of what are some of the ways that people have survived. And I see like the beauty in the craft work, right? Creating beauty even in the most horrific circumstances. So I feel like in my field, we have a lot to learn from that. And I would like now to look for instances of that. So I think we can learn from each other and maybe solidarity is one word that we can use, right? Co-witnessing, trying to put stories next to each other so that they can illuminate each other, not drown each other out, but illuminate each other with different kinds of questions, because I think in different historical circumstances, we have different kinds of questions that we ask.
Exactly, and also think about memory in more relational sense.
Exactly.
You know, like coming back, coming forth, learning from each other.
Right, and looking at the structures of power that are
Exactly.
very connected. We have imperialism, we
Oh, yeah,
have
we do.
colonization. I mean, we have all of those prejudices and racism. I mean, those connect all these different histories. They're not really separate from each other, but we also need to make space for the separation. So I think the ideas of comparative or connective memory could be really helpful. Not that we know how to work through the catastrophes of the present, because the catastrophes of the present, you can just look ahead and think about, let's talk again in 10 years and what happened with the events of 2023 and 2024.
Exactly.
And I'm not hopeful about that.
Well, let's hope it changes.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, dear Marianne, for your time, your answers, for being here. It has been very interesting to have you here and to talk to you, and you are always welcome at our university. Los invitamos a seguirnos y encontrarnos en otro capítulo de Entre Pares. Hasta luego.